Right.
Right.
We could talk about the nomological networks a little bit. So this is a way to establish. Let me introduce it a bit, okay? Because
Sure.
I think this is a simple way of introducing it. What you want to do to demonstrate that something is real, you sort of triangulate, except you use more than 3 positions of reference. So, for example, we've evolved. Our senses are a nomological network system. So we say that something is real if we can see it, taste it, smell it, touch it, and hear it. Now, each of those senses relies on a different set of physical phenomena, so they're unlikely to be correlated randomly. And we've evolved 5 senses because it's been our experience evolutionarily that unless you can identify something with certainty across 5 independent dimensions, it's not necessarily real.
Yes.
But we go even farther than that in our attempts to define what's real outside of our conceptions. Once we've established the reality of something using our 5 senses, then we consult with other people to see if we can find agreement on the phenomenon. And then we assume that if my 5 senses and your 5 senses report the same thing, especially if there's 50 of us and not just 2, and across repeated occasions, then probably that thing is real. Exactly. And a nomological network is sort of the formalization of that idea across measurement techniques in the sciences.
Yeah, I love the way you use the senses to introduce this, because there is a term that I didn't describe this phenomenon in the parasitic mind, but I've discussed it in other contexts. I call it sensorial convergence. So, for example, there's a classic study in evolutionary psychology by 2 folks that I know well, one of whom is a friend of mine, Randy Thornhill, where they asked women to rate the pleasantness of T-shirts that were worn by men. And it turns out that the one that they judge as most pleasing, olfactorily speaking, is the one that is also identifying the guy who is the most symmetric.
Yes.
So in other words, there is sensorial convergence so that 2 independent senses are arriving at the same final product, in this case, the product being the optimal male for me to choose. And it would make perfect evolutionary sense for there to be that sensorial convergence. So
right. And in the book, you introduce the nomological network, which isn't discussed very frequently in books that are written popularly, right? That's an idea that hasn't been discussed much outside of specialty courses, say in methodology, in psychology. I actually think the psychologists came up with the idea of nomological networks.
Yeah, so I'm going to describe what you just said and tell you how my approach of nomological networks is grander, if you'd like. So the folks who came up with the term nomological networks in psychology were coming up with a nomological network of triangulated evidence when establishing the validity of a psychological construct, right? So when you're establishing convergent validity and discriminant validity, right? The Campbell and Fisk stuff, which, by the way, if there are any graduate students in psychology, never mind graduate students in psychology, any student should read the 1959 paper, the multi-trait, multi-method matrix by Campbell and Fisk. It's one of the most
and there's an earlier one as well by Cronbach and Meehl in 1955.
Exactly, very good.
Struck validity and psychological tests.
Exactly.
Right, and it was part of the American Psychological Association's efforts to develop standards for psychological testing. So it is, in fact, a method of defining what's real. How do you know that something's real? And that's what a normal...
So if each of these validity constructs points to ticking off this construct as being valid, then I've now, in a nomological network sense, established the veracity of that construct, the validity of that construct.
Right, and that's actually something a bit different than a pragmatic a proof of truth. Because from the pragmatic perspective, the theory is evaluated with regards to its utility as a tool. This is more like an analogy to sensory reality.
Exactly.
If something registers across multiple different methods of detecting it, it's probably real.
Detecting it across cultures, across space, across time, across methodologies, across paradigms. So it's really the granddaddy of nomological networks. If Cronbach and Campbell and Fisk were talking in a more limited sense of how do you validate a psychological construct, this is saying how do you validate the veracity of a phenomenon? How do I establish that toy preferences are not singularly socially constructed? How can I establish that? So maybe
right, and you do that by studying primates, for example.
You study primates. So now here I'm doing across species. Now I'm going to do across cultures. Now I'm going to do across time periods.
And then you might look at androgenized versus non-androgenized children, and you can look across variation in hormonal status.
I am so delighted by how closely you've read the book. I am honored, my good man, that you're exactly right. And so if one box within my nomological network did not convince you, oftentimes the data in that one box is sufficient to convince you. But if it isn't, then by assiduously building that entire network, I'm going to drown you in a tsunami of evidence. And so I consider this an incredibly powerful way to adjudicate between and so, by the way, this is why in the book I demonstrate that it is not only used for scientific phenomena or evolutionary phenomena. By building a nomological network for the question of, is Islam a peaceful religion or not? In other words, I could use this grand epistemological tool to tackle important phenomena, even if they are outside the realm of science. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. Well, it's a matter of it. So to put it simply, it's a matter of collecting evidence. Okay. If you study if you approach a phenomenon from one perspective, you might see a pattern there. But then the question is, are you seeing that pattern because of your method, or are you seeing that pattern, like, are you reading into the data, or are the data revealing the pattern? Exactly. And the answer to that is, with one methodology, you don't know.
Exactly.
So what you want to do is use multiple methodologies, and the more separate they are in their approach, the better.